Hello there and welcome back to the Sleep Science. You're here right now, maybe stretched out under a blanket, maybe staring at the ceiling while the world outside has already decided it's done for the day. The room is quiet except for the soft electrical hum of modern life, and above it all, far beyond roofs, clouds, and the thin blue smear of atmosphere, the sun is still busy being the sun, blazing, pulsing, shedding energy in every direction, including yours. You probably won't survive this fully awake, and honestly, that's the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still conscious enough, drop a comment with your location and local time, because somewhere on Earth it's midnight, somewhere it's dawn, even somewhere the sun is rudely overhead, pretending sleep isn't a thing. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You imagine the sun as steady, reliable, a cosmic desk lamp that turns on and off like clockwork. But as you breathe slowly, you start to sense that this isn't quite true. The sun doesn't just shine, it churns. Rivers of plasma roll across its surface, sunspots open and close like enormous eyes, and invisible waves of energy wash over Earth all the time. Most days you don't notice, but late at night, when your thoughts get louder and sleep feels slippery, you might wonder why your body won't quite settle. Historians still argue whether ancient people noticed this connection consciously, but they absolutely organized life around the sun's rhythms. Long before alarm clocks bullied you awake. There's a mainstream fact to gently tuck in here. The sun operates on roughly an 11-year cycle of activity, swinging between quieter periods and solar maximums filled with flares and storms. Scientists have measured this for centuries using sunspot counts, and it's as real as gravity or taxes. What's more curious and a little fringe is that some early observers believe these cycles lined up with waves of human restlessness, mood changes, even mass insomnia. Was that confirmation bias or something more? Historians still argue whether these records reflect genuine biological effects or just poetic skywatching from people who didn't have Netflix. You lie there, second person and present, while your body keeps time with its own internal clock. When this circadian rhythm is usually synced to light and darkness, but light is only part of the story. The sun doesn't just send photons, it sends charged particles that buffet Earth's magnetic field. Most of the time, the planet shields you beautifully, like a cosmic weighted blanket. But during periods of high solar activity, that blanket ripples. Some researchers quietly suggest that your nervous system and electrochemical web itself might feel those ripples. Not enough to set off alarms, just enough to make sleep feel thinner. There's a quirky tidbit that refuses to go away. In the mid-20th century, a few bold scientists tracked hospital sleep complaints against geomagnetic disturbances and claimed to see patterns. Their data was messy, their conclusions controversial. Arian and their colleagues politely pretended not to hear them at conferences. Still, the idea lingered. Historians still argue whether these early studies were flawed by bad statistics or ahead of their time, like vinyl records waiting for a comeback. You shift slightly, maybe onto your side, and the narrative keeps flowing. Think about how global this would be if it were true. Not just you, not just tonight, but millions of people across continents, all subtly nudged by the same star. There's something oddly comforting in that. Your restlessness wouldn't be personal failure, just astrophysics being a little rude. Gentle sarcasm aside, modern sleep science admits that human sleep is far more sensitive than we once believed. Temperature shifts of a degree or two matter. Tiny changes in light exposure matter. Stress matters. So the idea that solar-driven electromagnetic changes might matter too isn't completely absurd. It's just inconveniently hard to prove. Here's another solid fact to anchor you. During strong solar storms, auroras become visible far from the poles. That means energy is actively interacting with Earth's magnetic field. At the same time, power grids, satellites, and GPS systems can hiccup. If delicate electronics notice, could biology notice too? Historians still argue whether drawing parallels between machines and humans is insightful or wildly misleading. But your body, after all, runs on electrical signals whispered between neurons. You breathe in, breathe out. Your eyelids grow heavier as the tone softens. A light joke drifts by. Imagine blaming the sun for your insomnia in a group chat. Sorry, can't sleep. A solar maximum. It would sound ridiculous, yet oddly poetic. Another joke, quieter now. At least the sun isn't asking you to check your emails. And one more, just for balance. If the sun really is messing with your sleep, it's been doing so for free, which is more than most wellness apps can say. The section glides forward without stopping, because sleep likes continuity. You don't need to decide anything tonight. You don't need to solve the debate. Just let the idea settle that your sleep exists inside a much larger system. Earth, atmosphere, magnetic fields, and a restless star 93 million miles away. Historians still argue whether the sun meaningfully disrupts human sleep or merely sets the stage for it. But the question itself has been enough to keep scientists, storytellers, and maybe you quietly awake. And as that thought fades, your body begins to do what it's always done best: adapt, soften, and drift. You drift onward without a hard reset, the way good sleep stories prefer. The sun is still there, doing its thing, but now your mind slides backward in time, far before blackout curtains and blue light filters. You find yourself among early humans who didn't have the luxury of pretending night was optional. For them, darkness wasn't cozy, it was instructional. It told you when to slow down, when to huddle close, when stories replaced tasks. Above it all, the sun's daily disappearance wasn't just sunset, it was permission to rest. You imagine standing on warm stone, barefoot, watching the sky deepen from gold to indigo. Ancient people didn't need sleep trackers because the heavens were the tracker. One mainstream historical fact settles in gently here. Many early civilizations, from Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt, structured their days explicitly around solar movement, not clocks. Work rose and fell with daylight, and sleep followed suit. Temples, cities, even calendars were aligned to solar events like solstices and equinoxes. That's not mysticism, it's urban planning guided by astronomy. But then come the stranger ideas, the ones whispered instead of carved into stone. There's a quirky, persistent tidbit from ancient Greece. Some physicians believe solar disturbances could agitate the vital spirits, making sleep lighter or more fragmented. They had no magnetometers, no EEGs, just observation and a lot of confidence. Historians still argue whether these theories were early intuitions about environmental influence or simply creative explanations for bad nights of sleep after too much wine. You keep walking through time, through cultures that watch the sun with almost parental attention. In ancient China, court astronomers were tasked not just with predicting eclipses, but with monitoring unusual solar behavior, because it was believed to affect harmony on Earth, including human health. Insomnia, irritability, and unrest were sometimes linked symbolically to solar imbalance. Historians still argue whether this was metaphorical statecraft or an early attempt at correlating celestial events with biological rhythms. Either way, the sun wasn't just light, it was authority. Your breathing slows as the narrative smooths out. Think about how these people slept. A no LED glow leaking under doors. No midnight snacks engineered for crunch. When the sun went down, melatonin, though unnamed, rose naturally. Yet even then, sleep wasn't uniform. There are records suggesting segmented sleep. First sleep, a waking period, then second sleep. Historians still argue whether this pattern was universal or exaggerated by a few poetic diarists, but it shows that human sleep has always been flexible, responsive, and shaped by environment, including the sky. Here's where the sun gets slightly mischievous again. Ancient Mesoamerican cultures track solar cycles with extraordinary precision. While most inscriptions focus on agriculture and ritual, a fringe interpretation suggests priests noted periods of communal restlessness during certain solar phases. It's controversial, debated, and possibly overinterpreted, but the idea refuses to fully disappear. Historians still argue whether these correlations reflect real observations or modern researchers projecting insomnia backward through time. You settle deeper now, maybe adjusting the pillow, because the tone is softening. A light joke floats by. Imagine trying to explain jet lag to someone who thinks the sun is a god. Sorry, Ra, my circadian rhythm is confused. Another gentle joke. Ancient humans didn't doom scroll. They just stared into the fire and overthought existence. Honestly, not that different. One more, quieter still. At least when ancient people couldn't sleep, they blamed the cosmos, not themselves. The sun's cycles continue, steady yet dynamic. While early societies lacked scientific language, they noticed patterns. Droughts, floods, mood shifts, a restlessness. Everything was interconnected. There's a solid fact worth tucking in. Solar observations were among the first systematic scientific records humans ever kept. That alone suggests the sun was seen as more than background scenery. It was a variable, something that changed and mattered. Historians still argue whether sleep specifically was part of those concerns, or simply bundled into a larger sense of cosmic order. You imagine lying in an ancient dwelling, stars sharp overhead, the sun long gone but not forgotten. The air cools. Your body, even now, responds similarly. Temperature drops cue sleep onset. Darkness cues hormonal shifts. What if, layered beneath all that, there's a quieter cue, one that doesn't care about culture or belief? That question would have sounded absurd thousands of years ago. Hey, but the curiosity itself is timeless. A fringe anecdote drifts in. Some Roman writers claim that periods of intense solar activity, described vaguely as troubled skies, coincided with poor sleep among soldiers. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor, morale issues, or something genuinely environmental. But the fact that they bothered to mention sleep at all is telling. Sleep mattered. Disruption mattered. Your thoughts loosen. You don't need answers tonight. You're just noticing how long humans have been paying attention to the sun, even when they didn't know exactly why. Ancient sleepers didn't isolate variables. They experienced the world as a whole. Sky, body, emotion, rest, all braided together. Modern science entangles those strands, but sometimes forgets how tightly they were woven. As the section glides forward, you carry this sense of continuity with you. The same sun that warms stone temples now hums above satellites and cities. The same star that set ancient bedtimes may still, in subtle ways, brush against your nights. Historians still argue whether that influence is measurable or merely poetic, but poetry has a way of lingering, especially when you're half asleep. And with that lingering warmth, your mind drifts onward, ready to follow the sun a little closer. You keep drifting, no sharp edges, no reset, just a smooth slide closer to the sun itself. Not the friendly yellow circle from children's drawings, but the real thing, boiling, restless, textured. You picture its surface like a living skin, forever bubbling and tearing itself apart. Those dark freckles you sometimes see in filtered photographs, sunspots, are where the story tightens. They look calm, almost sleepy, but they're anything but. Here's a solid mainstream fact to anchor you. Sunspots are regions of intense magnetic activity, cooler than their surroundings, and they tend to cluster during periods of high solar activity. Scientists have tracked them for centuries, noting their rise and fall in that familiar 11-year cycle. When sunspots increase, solar flares and coronal mass ejections become more likely. This is basic solar physics agreed upon, tidy as science gets. And yet tidy science often hides messy consequences. You imagine lying awake while the sun, millions of miles away, snaps and crackles. A solar flare erupts, releasing a burst of radiation that reaches Earth in about 8 minutes. You don't feel it directly, no dramatic zap, no cosmic buzz. But something subtle may be happening in the background, like interference on an old radio. Historians still argue whether humans can detect these changes biologically or whether the effects stop at satellites and power grids. The debate itself hums quietly like static under a lullaby. Sunspots have fascinated people for a long time. In the early 1600s, Galileo and other astronomers shocked the world by proving the sun wasn't perfect. It had blemishes. That discovery alone rattled worldviews. A quirky tidbit slips in here. Some 19th century physicians speculated that spikes in sunspot numbers correlated with outbreaks of nervous disorders, including insomnia. Their charts were hand-drawn, their methods enthusiastic but questionable. Historians still argue whether these early correlations were pseudoscience or crude first steps toward environmental medicine. You breathe slowly, letting the warmth of the imagined sun soften into something distant and manageable. Think about scale for a moment. A single sunspot can be larger than Earth. When clusters of them twist and interact, they can unleash energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. And yet, your concern isn't catastrophe, it's restlessness. Could something so vast really whisper rather than shout? Historians still argue whether large systems must have large effects, or whether biology is exquisitely sensitive to even the smallest nudges. There's a fringe idea that keeps circling the literature like a moth around a dim bulb. During solar maximums, some people report lighter sleep, more awakenings, more vivid dreams. The data is inconsistent. The effect size is small. Critics say it's noise. Proponents say it's exactly what you'd expect from a subtle influence spread across billions of nervous systems. Historians still argue whether this belongs in serious journals or late-night conversations like this one. You roll slightly, the pillow cool against your cheek. A light joke floats through. Sunspots sound adorable for something that can knock out satellites. Another one, softer. If the sun has freckles, does that mean it needs sunscreen? And one more, barely there. Imagine blaming your insomnia on a star having a bad skin day. Sunspots also affect Earth indirectly. Increased solar activity can disturb the magnetosphere, which in turn alters atmospheric electricity. That's a real, measurable phenomenon. What's debated is the biological relevance. Your brain runs on electrical signals measured in millivolts. Your heart keeps time with tiny ionic currents. Historians still argue whether external electromagnetic fluctuations are strong enough to matter, or whether your skull is the ultimate Faraday cage. You recall that during strong solar events, radio communications can fade, GPS can wobble, and polar flights reroute. These are not hypotheticals, they happen. So the question lingers, if technology notices, could your body notice in quieter ways? Perhaps not as insomnia, but as restlessness, altered dream texture, a sense that sleep never quite deepened. Historians still argue whether attributing such experiences to sunspots is insightful or simply a comforting externalization of stress. Or there's another odd historical footnote. During the peak of solar cycle 19 in the late 1950s, one of the most active on record, some researchers noted an uptick in sleep medication prescriptions in certain regions. Correlation is not causation, every scientist chants in unison. Historians still argue whether this was due to post-war anxiety, lifestyle changes, or something humming quietly from above. Your thoughts soften, edges rounding. You don't need to remember the numbers, just the feeling that the sun is not static. It breathes in cycles longer than your attention span, longer than a human lifetime. Sunspots appear, disappear, and reappear, like reminders that even stars have moods. As this section eases toward its end, you feel less alert, more receptive. The sun's freckles fade back into a warm glow behind closed eyes. Much whether or not sunspots tug at your sleep, they remind you that rest happens inside a living universe, not a clockwork one. Historians still argue whether that awareness itself changes how you sleep. But awareness, like gravity, has a way of quietly pulling you downward, and you drift on, ready to feel the sun's influence not just in light, but in fields you cannot see. You don't stop drifting. You sink a little deeper, as if gravity itself has turned down the lights. The sun is still active, sunspots still freckling its surface, but now the focus shifts from the star to the invisible bubble wrapped around your planet, Earth's magnetic field. You rarely think about it, which means it's doing its job beautifully. You imagine it like a vast, flexible shield stretching tens of thousands of miles into space, much deflecting charged particles and solar wind. This isn't poetic language, it's a mainstream scientific fact. Earth's magnetosphere protects the atmosphere and keeps radiation levels low enough for life, sleep included, to be possible at all. Without it, nights would be the least of your worries. Historians still argue whether humans intuitively sense this protection long before they understood it, or whether safety is only appreciated once it's threatened. During quiet solar periods, the magnetic field hums along steadily, almost boring in its reliability. But when the sun throws a tantrum, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, that field flexes. It compresses, ripples, and sometimes vibrates like a struck bell. This phenomenon is known as a geomagnetic storm, and it's measurable with instruments buried in rock and ice all over the planet. And that part is not controversial. What is controversial is whether those vibrations whisper their way into your biology. You lie there, listening to your own breathing, while Earth's magnetic field subtly sways above you. Here's where things get interesting. Your nervous system communicates using electrical impulses. Neurons fire, ions move, signals propagate. That's not fringe. That's neuroscience 101. The open question, the one scientists politely argue about in journals, is whether external electromagnetic fluctuations, like those from geomagnetic storms, can influence that signaling. Historians still argue whether the field strengths involved are biologically meaningful or laughably small. A quirky tidbit drifts in from the colder corners of research history. In the 1970s, some Soviet scientists reported correlations between geomagnetic activity and human sleep disturbances. Their papers described increased awakenings, altered dream reports, and general restlessness during magnetic storms. The methods were enthusiastic. The controls were questionable. Western scientists raised eyebrows so hard they nearly left their skulls. Historians still argue whether these studies were flawed, propaganda-era science, or overlooked data wrapped in bad methodology. You shift slightly, the blanket rustling like distant static. Imagine the magnetosphere not as a rigid shield, but as a living thing, stretching on the night side of Earth, snapping back during solar impacts. When it moves, electric currents flow through the upper atmosphere and even the ground. That's how geomagnetic storms can induce currents in power lines. Sometimes knocking out transformers. That's a documented, real-world effect. Historians still argue whether comparing transformers to human brains is reasonable or deeply unfair to both. And yet the comparison lingers. Your brain doesn't need much to change state. Tiny chemical shifts can move you from wakefulness to sleep. Slight temperature changes can delay deep sleep. A faint noise can pull you out of a dream. So the idea that magnetic fluctuations might subtly influence sleep architecture, timing, depth, dream vividness, doesn't sound entirely absurd. It just sounds difficult to prove. Historians still argue whether the absence of clear proof is evidence of absence or simply a limitation of current tools. A gentle joke slides in, barely waking you. Imagine Earth's magnetic field as the planet's mood ring, changing colors while you're just trying to nap. Another, softer. Geomagnetic storm sounds dramatic, but mostly it's just space weather being mildly passive-aggressive. And one more, almost whispered. If your sleep gets disrupted, at least you can't blame Mercury being in retrograde this time. There's a well-established fact worth tucking in here. During strong geomagnetic storms, people at lower latitudes can see auroras. Curtains of light caused by charged particles colliding with atmospheric gases. That means energy is actively interacting with Earth's environment. At the same time, some studies have reported small but measurable changes in heart rate variability during these events. Historians still argue whether those changes are stress responses, coincidental correlations, or hints of something deeper. Your body, meanwhile, keeps doing what it always does, adjusting, compensating, stabilizing. That adaptability is why you can sleep through thunderstorms and city noise. It's also why any solar influence, if real, would be subtle rather than dramatic. No cosmic jolt, just a nudge. A slightly longer time to fall asleep. A dream that feels oddly bright. A 3 a.m. wake-up with no clear reason. Historians still argue whether these experiences are universal or selectively remembered, Because they're unusual. There's a fringe hypothesis that some people are more magnetically sensitive than others. The evidence is thin, the mechanisms unclear, but anecdotes persist. Certain individuals report headaches, poor sleep, or agitation during geomagnetic storms. Skeptics point to anxiety and expectation effects. Proponents point to animal studies showing magnetoreception in birds and mammals. Historians still argue whether humans lost such sensitivity during evolution or never had it to begin with. You breathe in, breathe out. The pacing slows, sentences stretching longer now. You don't need to decide where you stand. Tonight isn't about belief. It's about noticing how layered sleep really is. Light, temperature, emotion, hormones, routines, and maybe hovering quietly above them all, fields you can't see but live inside every day. Earth's magnetic field has flipped many times in the planet's history. North becomes south, south becomes north. Life persisted, sleep persisted. Historians still argue whether such reversals affected ancient biology in noticeable ways, but the fact that life adapted at all is reassuring. Whatever the sun and magnetosphere are doing now, your body is part of a long lineage of adaptation. As the section glides onward, the magnetic field fades back into the background where it belongs. Not gone, just quietly doing its work. You feel heavier, safer, held. Whether or not geomagnetic storms disrupt human sleep, they remind you that rest happens within a dynamic, protective system that rarely asks for attention. And with that awareness, you drift deeper still, ready to notice how your own internal clocks respond to forces both obvious and unseen. You keep floating forward, not walking, not thinking too hard, just following the gentle pull of the story. The sun, the magnetic field, the invisible storms above your head, all of it now folds inward towards something far more intimate, your circadian clock. The quiet conductor inside you that decides when you feel alert, when you feel heavy, when sleep opens its door. This clock isn't a metaphor, it's biological hardware. A mainstream fact settles in calmly. Deep in your brain sits the superchiasmatic nucleus, a cluster of neurons that keeps time using light cues, hormones, and feedback loops. It's the reason jet lag feels like your soul is lagging behind your body. It's also why staying up too late feels wrong in a way caffeine can't fully fix. Historians still argue whether ancient humans experienced circadian misalignment as distress or simply accepted it as part of seasonal life. You lie there, eyes closed, while this internal clock ticks away. It listens closely to light, especially the blue wavelengths that scream daytime. That part of sleep science is well established. But light isn't the only input. Temperature shifts matter, meal timing matters, physical activity matters. So the question arises softly without demand. Could solar-driven changes in Earth's environment also matter? Historians still argue whether circadian systems are insulated from such influences or subtly responsive to them. There's a quirky tidbit from chronobiology's early days. In the mid-20th century, researchers isolating volunteers in caves found that their sleep-wake cycles drifted without natural light cues. Days became longer than 24 hours. Sleep fragmented. What's strange is that some subjects still showed rhythmic patterns that didn't quite line up with artificial lighting schedules. Historians still argue whether residual environmental cues, like geomagnetic signals, played any role, or whether the human brain simply improvises when bored underground. Your breathing evens out as the sentences lengthen. Circadian rhythms aren't just about sleep. They regulate hormones like melatonin and cortisol, body temperature, even immune function. Melatonin rises in darkness, nudging you toward sleep. Cortisol peaks in the morning, helping you wake. These rhythms are delicate. Small disruptions can echo through the night. Historians still argue whether solar activity could slightly alter melatonin secretion via indirect pathways, or whether that idea belongs in the maybe later pile of science. There's a fringe hypothesis that geomagnetic activity can influence circadian timing by interacting with the pineal gland, which plays a role in melatonin production. The evidence is thin, debated, and far from settled. Hawk skeptics roll their eyes. Proponents point to animal studies and subtle statistical signals. Historians still argue whether the pineal gland is a sensitive environmental antenna or just an overblamed pea-sized structure trying its best. You adjust the blanket, a small, sleepy movement. A light joke drifts in. Your circadian clock is very punctual until you give it a smartphone. Then it panics. Another softer. The clock does not care about your weekend plans. And one more, barely a ripple. If the sun is messing with your sleep, it's doing so on an 11-year schedule, which is wildly inconvenient for tonight. There's a solid fact worth holding on to. Circadian rhythms evolved under a stable pattern of daylight and darkness shaped by Earth's rotation and orbit around the sun. That makes the sun the ultimate timekeeper. And that whether you notice or not, any long-term change in solar behavior, even subtle, could theoretically ripple through biological timing systems. Historians still argue whether short-term solar fluctuations are filtered out or sneak through the system's defenses. Modern life complicates everything. Artificial light at night can overwhelm natural cues. Shift work, jet travel, and social schedules constantly tug your circadian clock out of alignment. In that chaos, detecting a faint solar influence becomes even harder. Historians still argue whether any observed correlations between solar activity and sleep are meaningful signals or statistical ghosts amplified by modern lifestyle stress. There's another odd observation tucked away in some datasets. During periods of high geomagnetic activity, a few studies have reported slight shifts in sleep onset times across populations. Not dramatic. Minutes, not hours. Critics shrug. Proponents lean forward. Historians still argue whether population-level nudges matter when individual experiences vary so widely. Your thoughts soften further. You don't need to measure anything. Your circadian clock is already doing its job, slowly lowering body temperature, easing muscle tone, inviting sleep stages to line up. If the sun is influencing that process, it's doing so quietly, like background music you stop noticing once you relax. Historians still argue whether humans are solar-synchronized creatures at heart, or whether we've mostly escaped that influence through technology. The truth, as usual, likely lives somewhere in between. You are both ancient biology and modern habit, swirling both cosmic and domestic. As this section glides onward, your internal clock keeps ticking, but more gently now. Time feels softer, less urgent. Whether or not solar activity nudges your circadian rhythm, tonight it doesn't need to matter. The clock knows what to do, and you drift on, ready to notice how light itself, visible and invisible, slips through closed eyelids and into sleep. You don't snap awake between thoughts, you just slide forward the way night slides across the sky. The circadian clock keeps its gentle beat, but now your attention drifts toward light itself. Not just the kind you see, but the kind that moves quietly beyond your awareness. Even with your eyes closed, even behind curtains and walls, light still exists as a presence, a spectrum, a whisper. Most people think of light as visual, bright or dim, harsh or warm. But here's a calm, mainstream fact to settle in. Sunlight is made of far more than the narrow slice your eyes can detect. Ultraviolet, infrared, and other wavelengths travel alongside visible light, interacting with Earth's atmosphere in complex ways. During periods of high solar activity, the balance of this invisible light can change slightly. Not enough to burn, not enough to glow, but enough to be measured. Historians still argue whether being measurable automatically makes something biologically relevant. You lie there, eyelids heavy, knowing that your eyes are not the only light-sensitive parts of your body. Specialized cells in your retina, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, respond primarily to blue light and help regulate melatonin. That's textbook sleep science. Next, what's less settled is whether non-visual light exposure, especially at very low levels, can influence the nervous system indirectly. Historians still argue whether such effects are meaningful or mostly theoretical. There's a quirky tidbit that feels almost science fictional, but isn't. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station report altered sleep patterns not just from disrupted day-night cycles, but from unusual light exposure, including higher levels of cosmic and solar radiation. Shielding reduces risk, but the environment is different enough to matter. Historians still argue whether lessons from orbit apply to people tucked safely under blankets on Earth. You exhale slowly, letting the idea soften. Ultraviolet light doesn't reach you at night, but its daytime presence affects vitamin D production, immune signaling, and overall circadian health. Infrared radiation, meanwhile, is felt as warmth. It penetrates tissue more deeply than visible light and fluctuates subtly with atmospheric conditions. Some fringe researchers suggest infrared exposure patterns could influence relaxation or sleep quality. The evidence is thin, debated, and very much not bedtime reading material. Historians still argue whether infrared effects on sleep are real or simply the body responding to warmth and comfort. A light joke drifts by. Imagine telling someone you didn't sleep well because of infrared vibes. Another, quieter. Your eyelids are excellent blackout curtains, but they are not a total blackout theater. And one more, barely there. If sleep depended on blocking every photon, no one would ever nap. There's a solid, any grounding fact to hold on to. Light exposure during the day strengthens nighttime sleep. Brighter days lead to deeper nights. That relationship is one of the most consistent findings in sleep research. Because the sun drives daytime light, any variation in solar output, even subtle, could theoretically influence the strength of that signal. Historians still argue whether solar cycles meaningfully alter daytime light exposure at ground level, or whether Earth's atmosphere smooths everything out. Some studies have explored whether solar ultraviolet fluctuations correlate with mood and sleep changes across populations. Results are mixed. Small effects appear, disappear, reappear. Critics point to confounding variables like weather, lifestyle, and expectation. Proponents argue that biological systems often respond to patterns too subtle for simple cause and effect models. Historians still argue whether chasing these signals is insight or indulgence. You feel heavier now. The sentences stretch, words drifting more slowly. Invisible light becomes less of a concept and more of a background hum, present but not demanding attention. Even if solar activity changes the invisible light environment slightly, your body is built to adapt. It has layers of redundancy, buffers upon buffers. Sleep doesn't break easily, it bends. There's a fringe observation that during intense solar events, some people report headaches, eye strain, or difficulty relaxing at night. Skeptics point to anxiety triggered by news alerts about solar storms. Proponents point to timing correlations. Historians still argue whether awareness itself is the strongest mediator. If you know the sun is active, do you sleep worse simply because you expect to? You don't need to solve that. Expectation fades as consciousness softens. Light, visible or not, loses its sharpness. Your brain shifts towards slower rhythms, less concerned with photons and spectra. As this section glides onward, the idea settles gently. The sun influences Earth through more than brightness. Warmth, radiation, invisible wavelengths, all part of a layered environment your body navigates every day without complaint. Whether or not those layers subtly shape your sleep remains debated, but debate itself doesn't need to keep you awake. Your eyelids rest. The sun, far away, continues to shine in ways you cannot see, and you drift on, however, ready to step back into a world where ancient biology meets modern nights. You keep drifting, carried forward without effort, the way sleep likes to arrive when you stop negotiating with it. Invisible light fades into the background, and something more familiar takes its place. The soft glow of modern life, street lights leaking through curtains, phone screens pulsing on nightstands. The quiet, constant reminder that you live in a world where night is optional. You stand gently and without tension between two forces. Ancient biology on one side, modern cities on the other. This is where the sun's influence becomes harder to untangle, because it now competes with 1,000 artificial suns of our own making. Here's a grounded mainstream fact. Artificial light at night delays melatonin release and fragments sleep. This is not debated. It's been shown again and again. Historians still argue whether humans adapted too quickly to electric light or not quickly enough. You imagine the sun setting, doing its part, while your environment refuses to follow along. LEDs glow with blue heavy light, the same wavelengths your circadian system interprets as daytime. Even low-level exposure can shift sleep timing. Against that backdrop, any subtle solar influence becomes harder to detect, like a whisper in a crowded room. Historians still argue whether modern light pollution has effectively drowned out whatever faint solar signals once mattered. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into the history of electrification. When cities first adopted electric streetlights in the late 19th century, newspapers reported increased nighttime activity and complaints of poor sleep. People stayed out later. Businesses extended hours. Sleep shortened. No solar storms required. Historians still argue whether this marked the first large-scale experiment in overriding the sun's authority. You settle deeper now, the tone easing. Think about how different your nights are from those of your ancestors. Temperature controlled, noise buffered, light manipulated, and yet your body still expects the same ancient cues: darkness, quiet, coolness. Historians still argue whether this mismatch is the primary driver of modern sleep problems, or merely one contributor among many. There's a fringe idea that modern infrastructure may act as an intermediary between solar activity and human experience. During geomagnetic storms, power grids experience stress. Voltage fluctuations increase. Transformers heat. It's subtle, usually unnoticed. But some researchers speculate that the electromagnetic noise of modern cities could amplify or translate solar disturbances into environments your body's more sensitive to. Historians still argue whether this is a meaningful hypothesis or creative overreach. A light joke floats through. Your ancestors worried about the sun not rising. You worry about your phone not stopping. Another, softer. The sun sets politely, your devices do not. And one more, barely audible. If the sun is disrupting your sleep, it has a lot of competition. There's a solid observation worth holding. People in rural areas with less artificial light exposure often show stronger circadian rhythms and more consistent sleep timing. That's been documented across cultures. And whether they are also more sensitive to natural environmental fluctuations, including solar ones, is still unknown. Historians still argue whether urban living has dulled environmental sensitivity or simply overwhelmed it. You picture cities glowing from space, visible proof that humans have rewritten the night. Satellites capture that glow easily. Detecting a solar influence beneath it becomes statistically challenging. Patterns blur, signals fade. Critics of solar sleep research often point to this complexity as a fatal flaw. Proponents argue that complexity doesn't erase influence. It just hides it. Historians still argue which side patience favors. Your breathing slows. You don't need to pick a side. Tonight isn't about blame. It's about context. The sun may still set the broad rhythm of life on Earth, but modern humans freestyle over it with artificial light, irregular schedules, and caffeine at questionable hours. If sleep falters, it's rarely one cause. It's an orchestra slightly out of tune. There's another small, debated observation. During major solar storms, reports of insomnia sometimes spike more noticeably in highly electrified regions than in less developed ones. Correlation, again, is slippery. Historians still argue whether infrastructure mediates biological effects or whether reporting bias does all the work. You let that thought loosen and fade. The city outside continues to glow, but inside your body, ancient systems still hum along. Melatonin still rises when it can. Temperature still drops. Muscles still soften. The sun, artificial or not, eventually loses its grip. As this section glides forward, into the tension between ancient rhythms and modern habits gently dissolves. You don't need to reject technology or worship the sun. You just need rest. And rest, stubborn and forgiving, finds ways to arrive anyway. And you drift on, ready to notice what happens when scientists step back and look at sleep not in one bedroom, but across the entire world. You move forward without resistance, the way a long exhale carries you. The bedroom, the city, the individual night all begin to blur, and your perspective gently lifts. Now you're not just one person trying to sleep. You're millions, continents turning, time zones sliding under the same sun, patterns emerging only when you stop looking at any single bed. This is where the data lives, not dramatic, not cinematic, but quietly intriguing. A mainstream fact settles in. Over the past few decades, your researchers have collected massive data sets on human sleep through surveys, wearable devices, medical records, and population studies. These data sets reveal trends: average sleep duration declining, variability increasing, insomnia complaints rising. The causes are debated, but the patterns are real. Historians still argue whether these trends reflect biological disruption or social change wearing a lab coat. You imagine Earth from above at night, a slow swirl of darkness and light. When scientists overlay sleep data on this rotation, they look for correlations with environmental variables: temperature, daylight length, weather, and yes, solar and geomagnetic activity. Most of the time, nothing jumps out, and then occasionally something does. Small shifts, subtle alignments, enough to raise eyebrows, not enough to settle arguments. Historians still argue whether eyebrow raising is a legitimate scientific outcome. There's a quirky tidbit from the early days of global sleep research. In the 1980s and 1990s, some epidemiologists noticed that reports of sleep disturbance clustered in time across widely separated regions. Not always explained by stress, news events, or weather. A few brave souls wondered about global environmental factors. The idea never quite caught on, but it never fully disappeared either. Historians still argue whether those clusters were artifacts of reporting cycles or hints of something planetary. You sink deeper as the tone softens. Modern wearable data has made this question more interesting and more frustrating. Millions of devices now track sleep stages, heart rate, and movement. Researchers can examine population-level sleep quality night by night. Some analyses suggest slight reductions in deep sleep or increased awakenings during periods of elevated geomagnetic activity. The effect sizes are small. Critics say they're meaningless. Proponents say biology often whispers before it shouts. Historians still argue whether small effects spread across billions of people matter more than large effects in a few. A light joke floats in: "Congratulations, your insomnia may be statistically insignificant." Another, gentler: "If sleep data were louder, scientists would sleep less." And one more, barely there: "Wearables know when you're awake at 3 a.m., but they still don't know why." There's a solid methodological challenge worth noting. Global sleep data is messy. Cultural differences, work schedules, reporting biases, blend and technology access all complicate interpretation. Separating solar influence from everything else is like trying to hear one violin in a city orchestra. Historians still argue whether better instruments will eventually isolate the sound or whether the music is simply too complex. Some studies have compared sleep data during major geomagnetic storms to baseline periods. Results vary. A few show increased restlessness. Others show nothing at all. Replication is inconsistent. This inconsistency fuels skepticism. It also fuels curiosity. Historians still argue whether inconsistent results invalidate the hypothesis or reveal a system sensitive to context and individual differences. You breathe slowly, letting the global view feel oddly personal. If the sun does influence sleep, it wouldn't knock everyone awake at once. It would shift probabilities, nudge distributions, make sleep slightly lighter for some, slightly later for others. Population effects rather than personal guarantees. Historians still argue whether humans are good at noticing probability shifts or terrible at it. There's a fringe angle that lingers in the background. During periods of intense solar activity, emergency room visits for anxiety and sleep-related complaints sometimes tick upward. Not always. Not everywhere. Correlation again refuses to behave. Historians still argue whether such signals reflect biological stressors, social contagion, or coincidence dressed up as data. You don't need to hold all these threads. Your mind can loosen its grip. The global picture doesn't demand a conclusion tonight. It simply suggests that sleep, like climate, may be shaped by many overlapping forces, some obvious, some subtle, some still argued over in polite academic language. As the section glides onward, the planet keeps turning beneath you. Night follows day. People fall asleep, wake up, toss, turn. The sun rises for some while others drift into dreams. If there is a solar fingerprint on human sleep, it's faint, distributed, and easy to miss unless you zoom out far enough. And you drift on, ready to slip into the strange territory where the sun meets the dreaming mind. You don't drop into dreams yet. You hover at the edge, that soft shoreline where images begin to loosen and logic politely excuses itself. If the sun touches sleep at all, some say this is where it leaves fingerprints. Not in how long you sleep, but in what unfolds once you're there. Dreams. Right, you imagine nights when dreams feel unusually vivid, colors sharper, stories stranger, emotions louder. You wake with the sense that something important almost made sense. Here's a grounded fact to rest on. Dream recall and intensity are closely linked to sleep fragmentation and REM sleep density. More awakenings often mean more remembered dreams. That's standard sleep science. Historians still argue whether external environmental factors meaningfully influence REM patterns or whether dreams simply respond to internal noise. Now comes the curious part. Some sleep researchers have noted that during periods of high solar or geomagnetic activity, reports of vivid or bizarre dreams increase slightly in certain populations. Not universally, not predictably, just enough to keep the idea alive. Critics say this reflects stress, suggestion, or coincidence. Proponents suggest that subtle arousals during REM sleep, possibly triggered by environmental fluctuations, could enhance dream recall. Historians still argue whether this belongs in a lab or a poetry journal. You drift deeper, the tone slowing, sentences stretching like half-remembered imagery. Dreams have always been sensitive to context. Temperature, sound, emotional state, all can shape dream content. So it's not outrageous to wonder whether planetary conditions might also play a role. Historians still argue whether dreams are sealed off inside the skull or porous to the world beyond it. There's a quirky historical tidbit that refuses to stay quiet. During peaks of solar activity in the late 19th century, some diarists and writers remarked on unusually intense dreams. The records are anecdotal, subjective, and deeply unscientific. And yet, they exist. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect genuine environmental influence or simply the human tendency to notice dreams more during restless sleep. You shift slightly, still asleep enough to follow the story. A light joke drifts by. If your dreams get weird, blame the sun. It's been weird for billions of years. Another, softer. Dreams are already strange. They don't need help from a star. And one more, barely audible. If solar activity improves your dream recall, at least insomnia comes with perks. There's a solid neuroscientific anchor here. REM sleep is characterized by heightened brain activity, rapid eye movements, and emotional processing. It's a fragile state, easily disturbed. Small arousals don't always wake you, but they can intensify dreams or make them more memorable. Historians still argue whether geomagnetic or electromagnetic fluctuations could act as such micro-arousals, or whether that idea overestimates biology's sensitivity. Some fringe researchers have suggested that geomagnetic storms correlate with increases in lucid dreaming reports. The data is sparse, the claims bold, the skepticism immediate. Critics point out that lucid dreaming communities are already highly suggestible and enthusiastic. Historians still argue whether the overlap is meaningful or merely enthusiastic coincidence. You don't need to believe any of this. Belief isn't required for sleep. What matters is the feeling that dreams are not isolated events. They emerge from a brain still in conversation with the world, sounds, sensations, memories, and maybe, just maybe, subtle environmental rhythms. Historians still argue whether dreams are closed-loop simulations or open-ended responses to reality. Your breathing deepens. Imagery softens. Even the idea of the sun becomes abstract, a warm presence rather than a burning sphere. If solar peaks do influence dreams, it wouldn't rewrite their content. It would tilt the stage lights slightly brighter, making the performance more noticeable when you wake. There's another small observation from population studies. During certain periods of heightened solar activity, online dream-sharing forums see brief upticks in activity. Skeptics point to coincidence in social trends. Proponents point to timing. Historians still argue whether the internet is a valid dream laboratory or just a place where insomnia goes to talk. As this section glides forward, dreams loosen their grip on explanation. Wait, they don't need causes tonight. They just need space. Whether shaped by neurons, memories, emotions, or distant solar rhythms, they unfold anyway, generous, strange, and fleeting. You sink a little deeper now, closer to sleep's center. The sun, far away, continues its cycles. Your dreams, closer than breath, continue theirs. Historians still argue whether those cycles ever touch, but you don't need to. You're already drifting. You drift onward, past images and symbols, into something quieter and more chemical. Dreams fade into the background, and now the story moves through your bloodstream. Hormones, tiny messengers that don't care about philosophy, only timing and balance. If the sun nudges sleep at all, some say this is where it leaves the faintest fingerprints. Your body runs on cycles layered inside cycles. One of the most important for sleep is melatonin, the hormone that signals night. A mainstream fact settles in gently. Melatonin secretion rises in darkness, peaks during the night, and falls toward morning. It doesn't knock you out, but it opens the door. Cortisol, on the other hand, helps you wake. It rises before dawn, preparing you for the day whether you ask for it or not. Historians still argue whether these hormonal rhythms are rigid or surprisingly flexible in response to environmental change. You breathe slowly, imagining these hormones drifting like tides. Now zoom out, far out, past the atmosphere, into the heliosphere, the vast bubble carved by the sun's solar wind. When solar activity increases, that wind strengthens, compressing Earth's magnetic field and altering the space environment around the planet. This is established physics. What's debated is whether those changes echo all the way down into endocrine systems quietly doing their night work. Historians still argue whether that leap is imaginative or inevitable. There's a quirky but persistent tidbit from research that lives on the edge of acceptance. Some studies have reported small changes in nighttime melatonin levels during periods of elevated geomagnetic activity. Not dramatic drops, not complete suppression, just subtle shifts. Critics point out confounders like stress, light exposure, and sleep disruption itself. Proponents argue that melatonin is sensitive by design, evolved to respond to environmental cues. Historians still argue whether sensitivity implies vulnerability or resilience. You shift slightly, muscles loose. Melatonin doesn't work alone. And it interacts with serotonin, dopamine, and other neurochemicals that shape mood, relaxation, and dream tone. Cortisol interacts too, especially when sleep is fragmented. During stressful periods, environmental, emotional, or social, cortisol can intrude at night, lightening sleep. Historians still argue whether solar-driven environmental changes could act as mild stressors at a biological level, even if you never consciously notice them. A light joke drifts by. Your hormones are running a night shift with no coffee breaks. Another, softer. Melatonin is polite. It knocks. It doesn't kick the door in. And one more, barely there. If the sun is influencing your hormones, at least it's consistent about being dramatic. There's a solid fact worth anchoring here. Melatonin is not only regulated by light, it's also influenced by electromagnetic fields in laboratory settings, at least under certain conditions. The relevance of those experiments to real-world geomagnetic fluctuations is hotly debated. Historians still argue whether lab sensitivity translates to planetary-scale exposure or disappears in the noise of daily life. Some fringe researchers suggest that geomagnetic storms could subtly alter pineal gland activity, shifting melatonin timing by minutes rather than hours. Minutes matter in sleep science, but they're hard to detect without massive data sets. Skeptics say the signal is too weak. Proponents say weak signals add up across populations. Historians still argue whether population-level hormone shifts are meaningful if individuals don't feel them directly. You sink deeper, the pacing slowing. Cortisol comes back into focus. When elevated nighttime cortisol is associated with lighter sleep and early awakenings. During periods of environmental stress, cortisol rhythms can flatten or shift. There are reports, again, inconsistent, of altered cortisol patterns during geomagnetic disturbances. Critics blame lifestyle stress. Proponents note timing alignments. Historians still argue whether cortisol is too easily influenced to be a reliable marker of solar effects. There's another odd observation from occupational studies. People working in polar regions, where geomagnetic activity is stronger and auroras frequent, sometimes show altered sleep hormone profiles during active solar periods. The sample sizes are small, the conditions extreme. Historians still argue whether polar biology can tell us anything about life at lower latitudes, or whether it's a category error wrapped in snow. Your thoughts soften further. Hormones don't announce themselves. They work quietly, cumulatively. If solar activity nudges them at all, it wouldn't feel like a switch flipping. It would feel like what you already know. Sleep that takes longer to arrive, dreams that feel brighter, awakenings that seem unprovoked. Historians still argue whether that familiarity is evidence against solar influence or exactly what subtle influence would look like. A gentle reminder drifts in. The endocrine system evolved in an environment shaped entirely by the sun. Day length, seasons, temperature, food availability, all solar-driven. It would be strange if hormones were completely insulated from solar variability. However, it would also be strange if they were dramatically controlled by it. Historians still argue whether biology favors buffering or responsiveness when it comes to cosmic inputs. You don't need to resolve that tonight. Your hormones are already doing what they do best, settling into night mode, lowering alertness, softening edges. Melatonin rises whether you analyze it or not. Cortisol retreats, mostly. The sun, far away, continues to breathe in cycles measured in years, not hours. As this section glides onward, chemistry fades into comfort. Whatever the heliosphere is doing, whatever the sun is throwing into space, your body has handled worse. It has adapted through ice ages, heat waves, migrations, and modern stress. Sleep, stubborn and ancient, persists, and you drift on, ready to notice how other creatures respond to the same star, often before humans ever do. You drift onward, carried by chemistry into instinct, into something older than language. Before humans argued about data and hormones, other creatures were already responding to the sun in ways that didn't require explanation. Animals don't file sleep complaints. They just change. You imagine the planet again, but this time alive with motion. Birds settling, mammals curling, insects quieting into stillness. Sleep in the animal world is exquisitely tuned to environment. Here's a calm, mainstream fact. Many animals alter their sleep patterns in response to changes in light, temperature, and geomagnetic conditions. This is well documented, especially in migratory species. Historians still argue whether humans are simply less attentive to these cues or have genuinely dulled their sensitivity. Birds are often the first to come up in this conversation. Some species navigate using Earth's magnetic field, a sense known as magnetoreception. That's not fringe anymore. It's supported by decades of research. Specialized proteins in their eyes and brains respond to magnetic fields, helping them orient during long migrations. If birds can feel geomagnetic changes well enough to cross oceans, it raises an uncomfortable question. Historians still argue whether humans share any residual version of this sense or lost it somewhere between campfires and coffee machines. You sink deeper as the animal world moves quietly around you. There's a quirky tidbit that's oddly soothing. During periods of strong geomagnetic activity, some farmers have reported changes in livestock behavior. Restlessness, altered sleep-wake cycles, even shifts in feeding times. The reports are anecdotal, scattered, and often dismissed, but they persist across cultures. Historians still argue whether these observations reflect genuine biological responses or the human habit of noticing patterns when animals misbehave. Marine animals offer another strange clue. Whales, dolphins, and seals rely on geomagnetic cues for navigation. During periods of intense solar activity, mass strandings sometimes increase. This is controversial, hotly debated, and emotionally charged. Critics point to sonar, pollution, and illness. Proponents note timing overlaps with geomagnetic disturbances. Historians still argue whether the sun deserves any blame at all or whether it's being scapegoated for human-caused problems. You breathe slowly, letting the examples wash over you. Animals don't separate sleep from survival. When conditions change, behavior changes. Some rodents show altered activity patterns during geomagnetic storms, becoming more restless or shifting their rest periods. Laboratory studies have replicated parts of this under controlled conditions. Historians still argue whether lab animals, removed from natural context, tell us anything useful about life in the wild or in a bedroom. A light joke drifts in. Animals don't doom scroll when they can't sleep. They just rearrange their nests. Another softer. Your cat has been judging your sleep hygiene silently for years. And one more. So barely there. If birds can feel magnetic fields, that explains why they look so confident about directions. There's a solid biological anchor here. Many animals have circadian and circannual rhythms, tightly linked to environmental cycles. Sleep timing, duration, and depth shift with seasons, food availability, and light exposure. Because these cycles evolved under solar influence, it's reasonable to suspect that solar variability could ripple through them. Historians still argue whether such ripples are dampened in complex organisms like humans or merely hidden under layers of behavior. Insects provide another curious angle. Bees, for example, show altered foraging and rest patterns during geomagnetic disturbances. Some studies suggest navigation errors and increased agitation. Critics argue these effects are minor and inconsistent. Proponents note that insects are small, electrically sensitive systems. Historians still argue whether size makes organisms more vulnerable to environmental fluctuations, or simply more studied. You lie there still while the animal kingdom hums softly in the background of thought. Animals don't interpret sensations as insomnia or anxiety. They respond and move on. That simplicity can make their reactions clearer. When restlessness appears across species during certain environmental conditions, it's harder to dismiss outright. Historians still argue whether cross-species patterns strengthen the solar sleep hypothesis or merely complicate it. There's another fringe observation tucked into ecological studies. During years of high solar activity, some researchers have noted shifts in breeding timing and rest patterns across multiple species. These shifts are small, often seasonal, and easy to miss. Historians still argue whether solar cycles subtly synchronize biological rhythms across ecosystems or whether climate and food availability do all the heavy lifting. Your thoughts soften, drifting toward empathy rather than analysis. If animals adjust before humans notice anything, it wouldn't be surprising. Humans are buffered by buildings, routines, technology, and stories we tell ourselves. Animals live closer to the raw signals. Historians still argue whether modern humans are insulated from environmental rhythms or simply distracted from them. A gentle calm settles in. You don't need to compare yourself to birds or bees, but their existence offers perspective. Sleep didn't evolve in isolation. It evolved in a world shaped by a star that changes, pulses, and occasionally flares. Animals adapted without spreadsheets or peer review. They listened with bodies. As this section glides onward, the animal world quiets, settling into its own rest. If the sun stirs the biosphere during active periods, animals may feel it first, shifting subtly, sleeping differently, moving at odd hours. Whether humans feel the same and call it insomnia is still debated. Historians still argue whether we are late to notice or simply too loud to hear. And with that thought easing into the background, you drift on, ready to notice how modern technology may translate the sun's distant moods into something much closer to home. You drift onward, still weightless, while animals fade back into the dark. Now something hums closer to home. Technology. The invisible web of machines that surrounds you even while you sleep. Satellites overhead, power lines outside, routers blinking patiently. If the sun has moods, this is where they sometimes get translated into something unmistakably human. Here's a steady mainstream fact to settle in. Solar activity can and does disrupt technology. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections can interfere with satellites, radio communications, GPS accuracy, and power grids. This isn't speculative. Engineers plan for it. Agencies monitor it constantly. When the sun sneezes, modern infrastructure reaches for a tissue. Historians still argue whether society fully appreciates how dependent it has become on systems vulnerable to a restless star. You imagine solar energy slamming into Earth's magnetic field, inducing currents that travel through long conductors like power lines and pipelines. During strong geomagnetic storms, These induced currents can overload transformers and destabilize electrical networks. That's documented history. Entire regions have lost power this way. Historians still argue whether these rare but dramatic events distract from the quieter, more frequent disturbances that don't make headlines. You lie there half asleep, surrounded by devices that hum softly even when you're not using them. Some researchers have suggested that during geomagnetic activity, fluctuations in electrical grids can subtly increase electromagnetic noise in urban environments. The idea is controversial. Measurements are difficult. Critics argue the levels are too low to matter biologically. Proponents counter that sleep is a state of heightened sensitivity. Historians still argue whether sensitivity increases vulnerability or simply awareness. A quirky tidbit drifts in from the world of satellite operators. During solar storms, onboard systems can glitch in unexpected ways. Phantom commands, sensor errors, momentary resets. These aren't catastrophic, just odd. Historians still argue whether the unpredictability of these effects mirrors the difficulty of studying biological responses to the same events. You breathe slowly, the room quiet. Think about how much of your night depends on stable technology. Climate control keeps the temperature right. Alarms stand guard for morning. Networks sync time. If solar activity nudges any of these systems, even slightly, the environment you sleep in changes. A room runs warmer. A hum grows louder. A light flickers. Historians still argue whether indirect effects like these matter more than any direct biological influence. A light joke drifts by. The sun doesn't know you own a smart thermostat, and it doesn't care. Another, softer. Somewhere, an engineer is awake so you can sleep. And one more, barely audible. Space weather is the only forecast that can knock out both GPS and your bedtime routine. There's a solid observation worth anchoring. During major solar storms, reports of sleep disruption often coincide with widespread technological issues, power fluctuations, communication outages, heightened alertness due to news coverage. Skeptics argue this explains most of the effect. Proponents say it doesn't explain everything, especially when disturbances occur without awareness. Historians still argue whether perception is the dominant pathway or just one of several. There's also a fringe hypothesis that modern humans may be more sensitive to solar activity precisely because of technology. Not because our biology changed, but because our environment did. Long conductive structures, dense electrical networks, and constant background fields may amplify or reshape solar-driven fluctuations. Historians still argue whether this turns cities into giant, unintended experiments, or whether it's an elegant theory with no measurable bite. You sink deeper, the narrative smoothing out. Technology doesn't feel threatening now. It feels like water, everywhere, supportive, occasionally turbulent. If the sun stirs that water, the ripples reach you gently, not as waves. A slightly restless night, a sense of unease without a story attached. Historians still argue whether such experiences are environmental echoes or simply the mind filling in blanks. There's a historical footnote worth noting. During the Great Geomagnetic Storm of 1859, the Carrington event, telegraph operators reported shocks, sparks, and spontaneous operation of equipment. People at the time also described agitation and sleeplessness, though records are sparse. Historians still argue whether those human reports were stress responses to chaos or genuine physiological reactions to an unprecedented solar event. Your breathing slows further. You don't need to fear technology or the sun. Both are just systems interacting. Your sleep exists at their intersection, buffered by walls, routines, and a nervous system evolved to cope with change. If solar activity sneaks into your night through wires and waves, it does so quietly. As this section glides onward, the machines around you fade into the background hum they're meant to be. Satellites continue their silent arcs. Grids stabilize. The sun keeps shining, oblivious to how delicately everything depends on it. And you drift on, ready to hover over the arguments themselves, where scientists pause, disagree, and politely refuse to let the question rest. You drift into quieter air now, where voices lower and sentences slow, because this is where the uncertainty lives. Not the thrilling kind, not the ominous kind, just the steady hum of scientific disagreement. Debates among sleep scientists don't happen with shouting, or dramatic music. They happen in careful language, raised eyebrows, and phrases like insufficient evidence and requires further study. Well, here's the grounded fact to rest on. There is no scientific consensus that solar activity directly disrupts human sleep in a strong or predictable way. That statement is true, important, and often misunderstood. But it doesn't mean the idea has been dismissed. It means it lives in the gray zone, where questions linger longer than answers. Historians still argue whether science progresses faster by embracing gray zones or avoiding them. On one side of the debate, skeptics speak calmly. They point to small effect sizes, inconsistent replication, and the overwhelming influence of lifestyle factors. Light exposure, stress, caffeine, schedules. They argue that when you control for these, solar effects mostly vanish. From this view, blaming the sun for poor sleep is a distraction from problems much closer to the pillow. Historians still argue whether skepticism protects science or slows curiosity. On the other side, proponents lean in just as calmly. They argue that subtle global influences rarely announce themselves loudly. Biology, they say, is nonlinear. Small inputs can have context-dependent effects. They point to converging hints: animal behavior, hormone fluctuations, geomagnetic correlations, population-level sleep data. None decisive alone, suggestive together. Historians still argue whether convergence without clarity is meaningful or misleading. There's a quirky academic tidbit here. Some of the strongest disagreements aren't about data, but about philosophy. Should science only investigate effects that are easily isolatable, or should it pursue complex systems even when variables can't be fully controlled? Sleep, after all, is one of the most complex states the brain enters. Historians still argue whether sleep science is too cautious or wisely patient. A light joke drifts by. Scientists argue politely so you can sleep impolitely. Another, softer, more research needed is academia's lullaby. And one more, barely there. Debates last longer than solar cycles. Now the tone shifts. The pacing slows. This is where analysis loosens its grip. You don't need the argument to resolve tonight. Uncertainty doesn't need to keep you awake. Wind down begins you're safe here, wrapped in not knowing. Questions soften when you stop pushing them. The sun continues its distant work, cycling patiently, unconcerned with journals or conclusions. Earth keeps turning. Night keeps arriving. What your body keeps doing what it has practiced for thousands of generations, settling into rest despite unanswered questions. Sleep doesn't require certainty. It only requires enough quiet for the nervous system to exhale. Whatever the sun may or may not be doing to human sleep, it isn't demanding anything from you right now. You don't have to monitor space weather. You don't have to decide which side is right. Your breathing lengthens. Thoughts stretch out and thin. Debates fade into background murmurs like voices in another room. Even scientists sleep without answers, especially scientists. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen. Imagine the question itself dimming, not solved, just set down. Curiosity can rest too. The night is allowed to be simple. You are allowed to sleep inside mystery. You don't snap back to alertness after the wind down. You float out of it, like surfacing just enough to hear a story being told nearby. The debates have quieted, and now older voices take their turn. Softer, symbolic, half-remembered. Cultures that didn't have magnetometers or sleep labs still tried to explain why some nights refused to cooperate, and often they looked up. Across history, people blame the sun for more than just droughts and heat. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ground you gently. Many ancient cultures linked celestial bodies to health and sleep, weaving solar events into medical and spiritual explanations. This wasn't fringe mysticism at the time. It was the best framework available. The sky was the largest system anyone could see, and so of course it became the explanation for what happened inside the body at night. Historians still argue whether these myths encoded real observations or simply gave shape to anxiety. You drift through ancient Egypt, where the sun god Ra traveled through the underworld each night. Some texts suggest that when Ra's journey was troubled, people experienced disturbed rest and unsettling dreams. Not because of physics, but because order itself felt threatened. A quirky tidbit lingers here. Priests sometimes prescribe changes in sleep rituals during certain solar periods, different prayers, different bedtimes, to restore harmony. Historians still argue whether these rituals had psychological benefits or were early attempts at sleep hygiene wrapped in theology. You float onward to ancient Rome, where Pliny the Elder wrote about the sun's influence on temperament and rest, suggesting that excessive solar heat could agitate the mind even after sunset. It sounds poetic, but it reflects a genuine belief that the sun's energy lingered into the night. Historians still argue whether Roman complaints about poor sleep were environmental observations or just the result of loud neighbors and bad wine. A light joke drifts in. Humans have been blaming the sun for bad sleep long before blaming smartphones. Another, softer. At least ancient insomnia came with a mythological explanation. And one more, barely there. Imagine telling a sun god you couldn't sleep. That's a bold bedtime complaint. You move through medieval Europe, where solar eclipses were feared not just for daylight disruption, but for their supposed effects on sleep and dreams. What people reported nightmares, restless nights, and anxiety following eclipses. The fear itself mattered. Historians still argue whether the sleeplessness came from cosmic influence or from lying awake, worrying the world might end before morning. In parts of Asia, traditional medical systems associated excess yang, linked symbolically to the sun, with agitation, insomnia, and vivid dreams. Treatments aim to restore balance, not block the sun. Cool environments, calming routines, gentle herbs. A quirky tidbit here. Some practices recommended avoiding sleep immediately after intense daylight exposure, suggesting that solar energy needed time to settle. Historians still argue whether this reflects metaphorical thinking or an intuitive grasp of circadian transitions. You sink deeper, stories washing over you without demanding belief. Myths don't ask to be proven, they ask to be felt. They reflect how humans experience their nights. When sleep broke, something powerful must have shifted, and the most powerful thing in the sky was always the sun. Historians still argue whether myth preserves memory better than data ever could. Indigenous cultures across the Americas also told stories of restless nights following unusual solar behavior. Among some groups, intense sunlight was believed to overstimulate the spirit, requiring evening rituals to calm the body before sleep. Drums slowed, fires dimmed, voices lowered. Historians still argue whether these practices were symbolic or whether they genuinely supported better sleep in high-light environments. Your breathing stays slow. You don't need to sort truth from story. The point isn't accuracy, it's continuity. Across continents and centuries, people noticed that sleep didn't always respond predictably. Sometimes the day left a residue. Sometimes the sun felt like it followed you into the dark. There's another odd folkloric thread. In parts of Scandinavia, during periods of prolonged daylight, myths warned of sun-touched nights when sleep would be shallow and dreams sharp. Today we'd call it circadian disruption. Then it was just reality wrapped in story. Historians still argue whether folklore around sleeplessness in high-latitude regions reflects biological truth more clearly than modern terminology. A gentle humor passes through. Myths were the original sleep trackers, highly inaccurate but emotionally supportive. Another quieter. When you don't know why you're awake, any explanation helps. When you rest with the realization that before science tried to isolate variables, humans told stories to make peace with restless nights. Blaming the sun wasn't avoidance, it was integration. Sleep was part of a cosmic rhythm, not a personal failure. That belief alone may have been calming. Historians still argue whether meaning itself is one of the strongest sleep aids humans have ever used. As this section glides forward, myths soften into atmosphere. They don't insist the sun caused insomnia. They suggest it participated, a character in the story of night. Sometimes benevolent, sometimes overbearing, always present. You let those old stories fade gently. Whatever the truth behind them, they remind you that you are not the first person to lie awake wondering why sleep hesitated. You are part of a very long conversation with the sky. And as that thought settles, you drift on, ready to turn inward again, toward the personal, the individual ways people feel the sun, more than others ever seem to. You drift onward, quieter now, the myths dissolving into something more intimate. Not cultures, not animals, not populations, but you. Because even if the sun influences sleep at all, it doesn't do so evenly. Some people sleep through anything. Others feel every small shift. This is where the story becomes personal. You might already know this difference. Some nights, something feels off before you can explain it. No obvious stress, no caffeine too late. Just a faint buzzing under the surface. Like your body picked up a signal your mind missed. Here's a grounded fact to rest on. People vary widely in sleep sensitivity. Genetics, nervous system reactivity, stress history, mood and personality all shape how easily sleep is disrupted. Historians still argue whether environmental sensitivity is a trait or a state that comes and goes. You lie there, listening to your own internal weather. Some individuals are highly responsive to changes in light, temperature, noise, and routine. These high responders often report stronger reactions to seasonal shifts, jet lag, and sleep schedule changes. It's not weakness, it's wiring. Historians still argue whether this wiring also extends to less obvious environmental cues like geomagnetic fluctuations. There's a quirky tidbit from the world of chronobiology. Some people consistently show stronger physiological responses to circadian disruptions in lab settings. Bigger hormone shifts, greater heart rate variability changes, more pronounced sleep fragmentation, and researchers sometimes call them sensitive sleepers. Historians still argue whether these labels explain anything or simply rename experience. You settle deeper, the tone softening. If solar activity influences sleep subtly, it would likely affect these sensitive individuals first. Not because they're fragile, but because their systems are finely tuned. Critics argue that expectation and anxiety explain most reports. Proponents counter that sensitivity exists even without awareness. Historians still argue whether belief amplifies perception or perception creates belief. A light joke drifts in. Some people sleep through earthquakes. Others wake up when a thought changes volume. Another, gentler. Your nervous system is not dramatic. It's just thorough. And one more, barely there. Being sensitive doesn't mean you're broken. Why? It means you have excellent reception. There's a mainstream observation worth anchoring. People with anxiety, high stress, or hyperarousal tend to experience lighter, more fragmented sleep. Their systems remain alert longer into the night. If environmental factors add even a small extra load, sleep may tip from stable to restless. Historians still argue whether solar influences, if present, would matter only when the system is already near threshold. Some fringe surveys have asked participants to track sleep quality alongside space weather reports. Results are mixed. Some individuals show consistent patterns. Others show none. Skeptics call this self-selection and confirmation bias. Proponents say individual level effects would never appear clearly in group averages. Historians still argue whether personalized data is the future of sleep science or a statistical minefield. You breathe slowly, letting the idea of sensitivity feel neutral, even kind. Sleep doesn't fail randomly, it responds to load. Internal load, external load, emotional load, environmental load. If the sun adds even a fraction to that load during active periods, some people might feel it while others never notice. Historians still argue whether that variability invalidates the hypothesis or supports it. There's another subtle point. Sensitive sleepers often have vivid dreams, strong bodily awareness, and heightened perception during the day as well. The same traits that make sleep fragile also make experience rich. Historians still argue whether evolution trades robustness for nuance or vice versa. You don't need to label yourself tonight. You don't need to decide whether you're sensitive or not. The point is simply this. Sleep is not one size fits all. If something as distant as the sun brushes against human sleep, it would do so unevenly, quietly and personally. Your thoughts loosen further. The idea of personal sensitivity doesn't demand vigilance. It invites gentleness. More patience with nights that don't cooperate. Less blame. If your sleep wavers, it doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means your system noticed something. Historians still argue whether noticing is a burden or a gift. As this section glides forward, you feel less alone in your restlessness. Whether influenced by solar cycles or everyday stress, your experience fits into a wide spectrum of human sleep. Some nights are deep, some are light. Both are allowed. And with that acceptance settling in, you drift on, ready to feel the planet itself. How well it shields you, and how that shielding changes over time. You drift onward, still cushioned by acceptance. And now the view pulls back once more. Not to the sun, not to you, but to the space in between. The quiet guardian you rarely think about. Earth itself and the shielding it provides. You imagine the planet wrapped in layers, like a sleeper tucked beneath blankets. Atmosphere, magnetic field, ionosphere, each layer doing quiet work, filtering, deflecting, softening what arrives from space. Here's a steady, mainstream fact to settle in. Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere protect life from most harmful solar radiation and charged particles. Without them, sleep and life would be impossible. Current historians still argue whether humanity underestimates how dynamic and alive this shielding really is. This protection isn't static. Earth's magnetic field shifts, drifts, weakens in places, strengthens in others. Over centuries, the magnetic poles wander. Over millennia, they flip. This is well-established geology. What's less settled is how smaller, shorter-term variations in Earth's shielding might influence biological systems. Historians still argue whether short-term magnetic changes are biologically irrelevant noise or subtle background signals organisms evolved alongside. You lie there, breathing slowly, while Earth does its quiet work. During periods of strong solar activity, the magnetosphere compresses, allowing more energy into the upper atmosphere. Auroras bloom, currents flow. Most of this happens far above your head, but not infinitely far. Historians still argue whether far enough means irrelevant or simply unnoticed. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into paleomagnetic research. Some scientists have speculated that periods of weakened magnetic field strength in Earth's past coincided with changes in animal behavior and migration patterns. The evidence is indirect, debated, and incomplete. Historians still argue whether drawing biological conclusions from ancient rocks is inspired or irresponsible. You sink deeper as the pacing slows. Earth's shielding also includes the atmosphere, which absorbs and redistributes solar energy. Ozone filters ultraviolet radiation. Clouds scatter light. Winds move heat around the globe. These systems smooth extremes. They turn sharp inputs into gradients. Historians still argue whether biological systems respond more to sharp changes or to slow, rhythmic ones. There's a fringe idea that during times when Earth's magnetic field is slightly weaker or more turbulent, solar-driven influences might penetrate a little more deeply into the environment. Not dramatically, not dangerously, just enough to alter background conditions. Skeptics argue the changes are too small. Proponents argue that sleep is a threshold phenomenon. Small nudges can matter when systems are already balanced on the edge. Historians still argue whether thresholds are the right metaphor for sleep at all. A light joke drifts in. Earth is doing its best, and it hasn't dropped you yet. Another, softer. Shielding is like soundproofing. You only notice it when it fails. And one more, we're barely there. If the planet ever takes a night off, nobody sleeps. There's a solid historical anchor here. Measurements show that Earth's magnetic field strength has been slowly declining over the past couple of centuries. This doesn't mean catastrophe. It's part of natural variation, but it does raise interesting questions about long-term environmental sensitivity. Historians still argue whether gradual changes like this have any perceptible effect on human biology or whether adaptation easily keeps pace. You let that thought float without grabbing it. Shielding doesn't need to be perfect to be effective. It only needs to be good enough. And it has been, remarkably so, for billions of years. Life learned to sleep under a changing sky, under a star that pulses and flares. That alone suggests resilience. Historians still argue whether resilience means immunity or simply flexibility. There's another debated observation from space weather research. During periods when Earth's magnetic field is particularly disturbed, Certain atmospheric electrical properties change, ion densities shift, currents flow differently. Some researchers wonder whether these atmospheric changes could influence surface-level electrical environments in subtle ways. Critics point out dilution, proponents point out sensitivity. Historians still argue whether subtle is a scientific red flag or a biological reality. Your body, meanwhile, remains blissfully unconcerned. Heart steady, breath slow, muscles heavy. If Earth's shielding is fluctuating tonight, it's doing so within bounds your biology has navigated countless times before. Sleep doesn't require perfect protection. It requires sufficient safety. There's a reassuring truth worth holding. Humans have slept through ice ages, volcanic winters, solar maxima, and magnetic excursions without knowing the terms for any of it. Sleep adapted. Bodies adapted. Historians still argue whether modern anxiety about environmental influence reflects increased risk or increased awareness. You soften further, comforted by scale. Earth is not fragile in the way headlines sometimes imply. Its shielding systems are robust, redundant, and ancient. Whatever the sun sends, most of it is absorbed, deflected, or transformed long before it reaches you. If anything slips through, it does so gently, diluted by layers of protection. And maybe that's the key. If solar activity influences sleep at all, it does so only after passing through Earth's filters, atmosphere, and fields. By the time it reaches your nervous system, it's no longer a shout, it's a whisper. Historians still argue whether whispers are worth studying or whether they're exactly where the most interesting biology lives. Your thoughts slow to a near stop. The idea of Earth as a guardian settles in your chest, heavy and reassuring. You are not exposed. You are held, even under an active sun. As this section glides onward, the planet continues its quiet work, spinning, shielding, balancing. You don't need to monitor it. You don't need to worry about it. It has been keeping nights safe far longer than you've been alive. And with that sense of safety, you drift on, ready to peer gently into the future, towards solar cycles yet to come, and what they might mean for human sleep. You drift onward, held by that sense of safety, and now time stretches forward instead of back. Not sharply, not anxiously, just a gentle look ahead. The sun doesn't change randomly. It moves in cycles, patient and vast, unconcerned with calendars or headlines. If it influences sleep at all, it will do so again and again. Here's a calm, mainstream fact to anchor you. Solar activity follows roughly 11-year cycles, swinging between solar minimum and solar maximum. During maximums, sunspots multiply, flares intensify, and geomagnetic storms become more frequent. Scientists can predict the broad shape of these cycles, even if the exact timing of individual events remains elusive. Historians still argue whether humanity has become better at forecasting the sun, or simply more attentive to its moods. You imagine future nights, years from now, when the sun grows more active again. More auroras, more satellite alerts, more space weather headlines quietly scrolling past. None of it dramatic enough to change daily life, but enough to remind you that the star above is never truly still. Historians still argue whether increased awareness of solar cycles will amplify perceived effects on sleep or help contextualize them. There's a quirky but grounded tidbit from recent solar science. Modern models suggest that upcoming solar cycles may vary more dramatically than once thought. Some may be quieter, others unexpectedly intense. The sun doesn't always follow averages politely. Historians still argue whether variability itself is the most important feature, or just an inconvenience for forecasters. You sink deeper as the pacing softens. Future sleep research will likely be different from today's. More wearables, more longitudinal data, more chances to detect subtle, population-level effects. Some scientists hope that with enough data, solar sleep correlations, if they exist, will finally clarify. Skeptics suspect the signal will dissolve under better measurement. Historians still argue whether improved tools tend to reveal hidden truths or expose wishful thinking. A light joke drifts in. The sun runs on an 11-year update schedule with no patch notes. Another, softer, space weather forecasts are the only ones that can't tell you whether to bring an umbrella. And one more. We're barely there. By the time we understand the sun fully, it will already be doing something new. You imagine a future where people casually check space weather apps the way they check pollen counts or UV indexes. Not with fear, just awareness. Solar activity is high tonight, someone might say, the way they say it's humid. Historians still argue whether this kind of awareness would empower better sleep habits or create new anxieties. There's a solid truth worth resting on. Even if future solar cycles are stronger or stranger, human biology won't suddenly become helpless. Adaptation is built in. Sleep systems recalibrate. Circadian rhythms shift. The nervous system learns new baselines. Historians still argue whether modern humans have lost adaptability or simply adapted to different stressors. Some fringe thinkers suggest that as Earth's magnetic field slowly evolves, future generations might experience environmental cues differently than we do now. The idea is speculative, long-term, and impossible to test today. Historians still argue whether thinking on such timescales is visionary or indulgent. You let the future blur gently. You don't need predictions tonight. Tomorrow's sun will rise whether you anticipate it or not. Next decade's solar maximum will arrive without asking permission. Sleep will still happen in between. Your breathing deepens. The idea of future cycles doesn't feel threatening now. It feels rhythmic, comforting. A reminder that change doesn't always mean disruption. Often it just means variation within bounds life already understands. There's another reassuring fact to hold. Humanity has lived through countless solar cycles without noticing most of them. Sleep continued. Societies rose and fell for reasons far more terrestrial. Historians still argue whether the sun's subtle influences matter most when everything else is quiet, or least when life is loud. You drift closer to rest. The future doesn't demand preparation. It only asks patience. Whatever the sun does next, it will do it slowly enough for bodies to adjust, for nights to remain nights. As this section glides onward, the idea of future solar cycles fades into a gentle background rhythm. A long inhale, a long exhale. Time stretches, then loosens its grip, and you drift on, ready to consider something simpler and closer. How humans might gently adapt their sleep, not to fight the sun, but to live more easily beneath it. You drift onward, no urgency now, just a gentle return to the human scale. Not the sun's cycles, not future centuries, tonight. If the sun is restless, if the environment hums a little louder sometimes, the question becomes softer and kinder. How do you sleep with it instead of against it? This isn't about hacks or biohacks or heroic optimization. It's about alignment. Here's a grounded, mainstream fact to rest on. The most reliable way to improve sleep is to strengthen natural circadian cues. Consistent light exposure during the day, darkness at night, stable routines. This works regardless of solar activity. Historians still argue whether humans need complexity to feel in control or simplicity to actually rest. You imagine your day as a conversation with light. Morning sunlight tells your brain, start the clock. Daylight anchors your rhythms, deepening sleep later. Evening darkness tells your body you can let go. If solar activity adds subtle variability to that signal, strengthening the basics gives your system more room to adapt. Historians still argue whether modern sleep problems come from external disruption or internal inconsistency. There's a quirky but practical tidbit. People who spend more time outdoors during daylight hours tend to fall asleep faster and experience deeper sleep at night. This has been shown across age groups and cultures. It's not about chasing the sun, it's about letting your body remember what daytime feels like. Historians still argue whether this is biology speaking or nostalgia dressed as data. You settle deeper, tone slowing. Adaptation doesn't mean control, it means buffering. A gentle buffers help when nights feel lighter. Cooler rooms, quieter evenings, softer transitions. If something external nudges your nervous system, these buffers absorb the nudge. Historians still argue whether sleep hygiene is undervalued because it's boring, or boring because it works. A light joke drifts by. Your circadian rhythm loves routines more than your calendar does. Another softer. The sun is ancient. It doesn't need your feedback. And one more, barely there. Going outside is the original sleep app. There's a mainstream observation worth anchoring. People with regular sleep-wake schedules show greater resilience to environmental stressors, from noise to travel to seasonal changes. Resilience doesn't mean perfect sleep. It means quicker recovery. Historians still argue whether resilience should be the primary goal of sleep science rather than optimization. Some fringe but reasonable voices suggest that during periods of heightened solar or geomagnetic activity, being extra gentle with sleep expectations helps. Not forcing sleep, not catastrophizing wakefulness, letting the system settle in its own time. Skeptics say this is just good advice always. Proponents agree and see that as the point. Historians still argue whether context-specific advice is necessary when universal advice is already ignored. You breathe slowly. Adaptation can also mean psychological alignment. Knowing that sleep fluctuates for many reasons reduces threat. Threat is the enemy of sleep. If you wake at 3 a.m., your body doesn't need an explanation. It needs reassurance. Historians still argue whether understanding sleep too much makes it better or worse. There's a small, solid fact worth holding. Relaxation techniques, slow breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, gentle imagery, lower physiological arousal, and shortened nighttime awakenings. These techniques work regardless of cause, solar storms included, if they matter at all. Historians still argue whether ancient bedtime rituals function similarly without scientific language. You don't need to adapt to the sun specifically, you adapt to variability itself. That's what sleep evolved to do. Some nights deeper, some lighter, some filled with dreams, some passed in quiet stretches of half-wakefulness that still count as rest. Historians still argue whether redefining good sleep would solve more problems than any discovery about the sun ever could. Watch your thoughts soften further. Adaptation feels less like effort now and more like permission. Permission to sleep imperfectly. Permission to trust your body. If the sun hums louder some nights, your system can hum along without panic. There's another gentle reminder. Humans once slept without clocks, without exact bedtimes, without the idea that every night had to be identical. Variability was normal. Historians still argue whether modern rigidity has made us less tolerant of natural fluctuation. As this section glides onward, you feel lighter about sleep, not heavier with responsibility. Aligning with natural rhythms doesn't require vigilance. It requires listening and then letting go. And with that softness settling in, you drift on, ready to find calm even under an active star, sheen where rest becomes a choice to release rather than a battle to win. You drift onward, lighter now, as if the effort to sleep has finally stepped aside. The sun hasn't changed. It still crackles and pulses far away, but your relationship to it has softened. Calm doesn't come from controlling the star. It comes from realizing you don't have to. This is where stillness lives, not in perfect conditions, but in acceptance. Here's a quiet, mainstream fact to anchor you. Calm states of the nervous system are compatible with sleep even in imperfect environments. Humans can and do sleep in noise, light, movement, and uncertainty. Safety, not silence, is the deeper requirement. Historians still argue whether modern humans underestimate their own capacity to rest under less than ideal circumstances. You lie there, when noticing how little is actually required. A bed, a sense of being held, permission to stop monitoring. Even under an active sun, Earth remains remarkably stable at the surface. Nights still darken, temperatures still fall. Your body still knows the sequence. Historians still argue whether trust in that sequence is learned or remembered. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into stress research. People who frame environmental uncertainty as neutral, or even interesting, show lower physiological arousal than those who frame it as threatening. The same stimulus, different meaning, different sleep. Historians still argue whether meaning is the most underrated sleep variable of all. You breathe slowly, feeling the weight of your body pressed down in a reassuring way. Calm isn't the absence of stimulation, it's the absence of resistance. If solar activity hums quietly in the background tonight, it doesn't need a response. Your nervous system can hear it without reacting. Historians still argue whether non-reactivity is a skill or a state that arrives when effort ends. A light joke drifts by. The sun has been dramatic for 4.6 billion years, and you still manage to nap today. Another, softer. If stars could keep you awake, no one would sleep. And one more, barely there. Your body has outlasted every anxious thought you've ever had. There's a solid observation worth holding. People who practice letting wakefulness be calm rather than tense often fall back asleep faster. Paradoxically, not trying to sleep helps sleep return. Historians still argue whether sleep is the only biological process that improves when you stop chasing it. You let the room exist as it is. And sounds don't mean danger. Sensations don't require interpretation. Thoughts can drift through without comment. The sun can be active. The planet can hum. Your body can rest anyway. There's a fringe but comforting idea sometimes mentioned in contemplative traditions, that humans sleep best when they feel part of something larger rather than isolated inside their own heads. The sky, the earth, the rhythm of night, all reminders that you're not alone in this moment. Historians still argue whether this sense of belonging has measurable physiological effects or simply feels good enough to matter. Your breathing lengthens, pauses deepen. Even if sleep hasn't fully arrived yet, rest has, and rest counts. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish sharply between light sleep and deep relaxation at first. Both lower arousal, both heal. Historians still argue whether modern definitions of sleep underestimate the value of quiet wakefulness. You don't need to wait for a specific sensation to declare success. There's no finish line, just a gradual easing, like sinking into warm water. The sun continues its distant work. You continue yours, releasing. As this section glides onward, calm becomes less something you do and more something you allow. Under an active star, under a changing sky, you remain safe enough to let go. And with that gentleness settling fully into your body, you drift toward the final thought. Sleeping not despite the sun, but beneath it, the way humans always have. You drift into the final stretch without realizing it's final. There's no edge, no announcement, just a widening quiet, the kind that feels like night fully settling in. Everything you've moved through, the sun, the fields, the debates, the myths, softens into a single image. You, sleeping beneath a star that never truly rests. This is how it has always been. Long before questions, before data, before the idea that sleep should be perfect, humans lay down under the same sun. Here's a simple mainstream fact to rest on. Human sleep evolved entirely under solar influence. Day and night, seasons, light and darkness, all shaped when and how rest emerged. That means sleep didn't evolve to require a silent universe. It evolved to happen within one. Historians still argue whether modern sleep problems come from too much change or too much expectation of control. You lie there now, feeling the quiet weight of that truth. The sun pulses, flares, cycles. Earth shields, filters, softens. Your body adapts, adjusts, when it compensates. Nothing here is fragile. Everything is dynamic. Sleep isn't broken when it's light or interrupted. It's responding, the way it always has. Historians still argue whether resilience is sleep's defining feature or its most overlooked one. You imagine ancient nights again, but without nostalgia this time. Just continuity, fires dying down, stars sharp overhead, people sleeping in shifts, waking briefly, then sleeping again. No panic about wakefulness, no story about failure. The sun would rise again. It always did. Historians still argue whether modern anxiety around sleep is a cultural artifact rather than a biological necessity. A light joke drifts by, gentle and warm. The sun has never once checked if you're asleep on time. Another softer, billions of nights have passed without being optimized. And one more. They're barely there. Your ancestors slept without apps, and somehow you exist. You don't need to decide whether the sun disrupts human sleep. The question itself has softened, lost its urgency. Maybe the sun nudges. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it did more when nights were darker and less when cities glow. Historians still argue whether asking the question is more important than answering it. What matters now is how small you feel. In a comforting way. Small beneath a vast sky. small enough that you don't have to manage everything. Sleeping beneath a restless sun doesn't mean being at its mercy. It means being part of a system far older and steadier than any one night. There's a reassuring truth worth holding close. Even during the most active solar periods on record, humanity slept. Not always deeply, not always easily, but enough to dream, when enough to wake, enough to continue. Historians still argue whether survival itself is evidence that sleep doesn't require ideal conditions, only sufficient ones. You breathe in, breathe out. The sun, 93 million miles away, continues its work without knowing your name. And yet, everything that made you capable of sleep came from that same star. Warmth, light, rhythm. Even the chemistry in your body traces back to ancient solar energy stored in food and flesh. Historians still argue whether that connection is poetic or literal, but it feels real enough tonight. You don't need to monitor space weather. You don't need to interpret restlessness. If sleep is light, it's still sleep. If dreams are vivid, they pass. If wakefulness lingers, rest can still happen. Sleeping beneath a restless sun doesn't mean fighting it. It means trusting that your body knows how to rest in a moving universe. Your thoughts slow to a near stop. The idea of disruption fades, replaced by something steadier. Coexistence. The sun moves, Earth turns. You rest in between. There's nothing left to solve, nothing left to prove. Just this moment, heavy and safe. You are allowed to sleep inside mystery. You always have been.